During the medieval period, it was part of Germanic tradition that the heir to the throne started proving himself by commanding troops in times of war. The geographical area that encompassed the Kingdom of Portugal had been under Swabian and then Visigothic rule for centuries, and this tradition would last within the Portuguese monarchy, which, as with the others of Hispania, considered itself a descendant of the Visigothic kingdom. That is one of the reasons why King Afonso I made his son Sancho co-military ruler of the country, starting in 1170, when the prince was only 15 years old. Sancho was born in 1154 in Coimbra, but not with this name, for he was called Martin, given the fact his birth occurred on the day of the feast of Saint Martin of Tours. He was also not the oldest son of Afonso, for Prince Henry, born in 1147, was supposed to be the one succeeding the monarch. The problem was, he died in 1155, aged 8. Thus, Afonso changed the name of his second son, who was to be made king in the future, from Martin to Sancho, because it carried a more suiting Hispanic name, which had indeed been common among the kings of Navarre, Leon, Castile and Aragon for centuries. When Sancho was 15, his father made him a knight after the injury the king had sustained at the siege of Badajoz in 1169. Furthermore, due to becoming incapacitated, he made Sancho the military leader of Portugal, and a very good commander he certainly was, both on the offensive as in the defensive. Immediately in that year, he tried to conquer Badajoz for a second time for Portugal, together with the Portuguese warrior Geraldo Sem Pavor, but failed. Still, the young prince started to show his ambition. In 1173, King Afonso would sign a peace treaty with the Almohads that would last until 1178. In May of said year, after the truce had ended, Prince Sancho launched a military campaign with the goal of reaching and raiding Seville. The enterprise was extremely risky due to the fact that the Leonese and Castilians were in conflict with one another, making the Almohads focus in their northern border with Portugal. The Fusado departed from Coimbra, and the army grew in size every time the prince passed by a new city. Infantrymen as well as cavalrymen from Lisbon and Santarém joined the Infante as he passed through the latter city, with men of the militia of Évora and probably Templars. The Portuguese were able to amass a total of 5,300 men, 2,300 being cavalrymen and 3,000 infantrymen. Due to the scale of the operation, several men of the trust of the prince occupied positions of power. The ensign, Pedro Afonso, was the most important of these, for he was tasked with carrying the royal flag. As soon as the column crossed the Tagus and entered Almohad territory, their objective was to reach the Portuguese city of Évora, unnoticed, which they were able to do. There, they rested for 4 days. After leaving the city, the army made a 30-kilometer march to pass by the Valongo castle, with the territory on the way being attacked by the Portuguese. Finally, on the 15th of June, the army reached the city of Beja and pillaged the nearby territories. On the first days of July, the army finally reached the periphery of Triana. By that time, the civilians had already been informed of the whereabouts of the Portuguese, so the Almohad sent a large army to stop them from crossing the Guadalquivir river and reach Seville. The prince was informed of this and made camp close to Triana. In the morning of the next day, the two armies met at Triana, with the Guadalquivir river in sight. Sancho's troops were organized in the following manner: a vanguard, where the prince was, a central body, 2 wings in front of the vanguard and a rear guard. On the Muslim side, the army was organized in the same way, but with no wings, and was a lot more numerous. Though the Almohads chose the battlefields, they were too close to the river and the castle, becoming very difficult for the large Amazigh force to maneuver. Eventually, the battle started with arrows being thrown, as well as with the Muslims employing hit-and-run tactics. The Portuguese heavy cavalry was then drawn by these tactics, but moved very carefully towards its rivals. The knights had their spears pointed to their rivals, and when the sound of the horns played, the Portuguese advanced with great velocity. But the attack was a failure, with a lot of men having died. The Muslims quickly regrouped around the Portuguese knights, who failed to organize. Meanwhile, other cavalry charges came, but they were met with the same destiny. Eventually, the bulk of the Portuguese vanguard, who had launched attacks, became divided in 5. Not too long after, the ensign gave orders to the rest of the units, that is, the wings, the rearguard, and the central body, to go fully on the attack, for there was no other option. The wings launched themselves with great urgency, and little by little, the Almohad vanguard began to break. Finally, the cavalry led by Pedro Afonso, who had been trapped, was now free to go on the offensive. The knight tried the best he could to reach the Almohad central body and get the enemy's standard. The European cavalry succeeded in this effort, and immediately after, the Islamic rearguard, from afar, began to retreat. Thus, chaos ensued. The Muslims fled and tried their best to pass through the bridge over the Guadalquivir, even fighting with each other to get to Seville. Several of them, out of fear of being struck by the Portuguese, jumped to the river, and others, on the now claustrophobic space that was the bridge, as well as in other parts of the field, were being killed by the Portuguese. Eventually, all of the Islamic army that faced Sancho was either inside the walls of Seville or dead. The Portuguese then, probably, burnt the bridge and put their eyes on the periphery of Triana, which they sacked and destroyed. More important than that was the burning of many Almohad galleys stationed right in front of Seville. 4 days later, the Portuguese decided to march back to their kingdom. On their way back, they still had to face a Muslim raid and attempted conquest of Alcácer, which had been launched by the governors of Beja and Serpa. Sancho decided to divide the army, calling for 1,400 cavalrymen, who he would command, so that they intercepted the governors. Meanwhile, Pedro Afonso and the majority of the army would keep making their way to Coimbra. Sancho ended up intercepting the Almohads in Campo de Ourique before they ever arrived to Alcácer, and the 2 governors died in a battle won by the Portuguese. Thus, Sancho took his first steps in gaining the trust and respect of the Portuguese aristocracy, who now saw the prince as a capable military leader, which was an absolute necessity of equality to rule as a king during the medieval period. The transition of power wouldn't be challenged.